When you first look into the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they can seem overwhelming, especially if you read the official documentation. So we're going to take a laid back approach and just talk through what's going on with WCAG in plain and simple terms. And I'm going to use the WCAG overview on the screen with me to guide the discussion. Now, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are technical standards for web accessibility. So we use these standards to make the web more accessible to people with disabilities. And when we look at these technical standards, they're comprised of different success criteria or requirements that tell us what we need to do or what we need to account for accessibility. So that's all that's going on here. And I'm going to scroll down the WCAG overview, and we're going to go over the versions and conformance levels because this is a real source of confusion. So with the versions, the three primary versions in play are WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. Think of WCAG 2.0 as the classic standard. It was published in 2008. And then as technology evolved, so too did the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so in 2018, version 2.1 was published. So what happened with version 2.1 is they added additional success criteria or requirements to 2.0. And then recently in 2023, we had WCAG 2.2 released, and that added a few additional success criteria to 2.1. So while all of these different versions may seem confusing, what will unwrap that confusion is that we're just building on top of each version. So 2.1 builds on top of 2.0, and in effect, 2.1 includes 2.0 plus additional success criteria. And then the same with 2.2. 2.2 builds on top of 2.1. So there are just additional requirements or success criteria that are in 2.2. So think of it that way, and it becomes a lot less confusing versus thinking of these as completely different versions that are requiring completely different things. Now, when we look at conformance levels, they work the same way. They build on top of each other. And the conformance level that you want to zero in and focus on is conformance level AA. So there are three conformance levels. There are A, AA, and AAA. We want to focus in on AA, which is going to include single A. So AA includes single A. So all of the criteria that are in level A are also in level AA. And with AA, we're building on top of that. Now, we don't typically involve AAA success criteria. And the reason why is these can be very practically and technically difficult to be conformant with. So we usually just stay with AA, which still provides us with an excellent comprehensive level of accessibility. There's nothing wrong with going into AAA, but it can be very difficult to be fully AAA conformant. So that's what's going on with the different versions and conformance levels. So one more time, think of 2.0 as the classic version. And so when we looked at 2.1, when we look at 2.1, it adds 12 additional success criteria at level AA to 2.0. So 2.0 has 38 AA success criteria. 2.1 has 50 AA success criteria. And remember that 2.1 is building on top of 2.0. So 2.1 adds just 12 additional success criteria to 2.0 for a total of 50. And then when we look at WCAG 2.2, it adds 6 additional success criteria. Now, when I talk about success criteria and requirements, same thing. Keep in mind that some success criteria are more simple than others. Others are more easy to meet than others. Some are very technically complex and they require someone with a development background to implement them. Others of them are fairly simple and straightforward, and even someone who is non-technical can implement the success criteria. So that's really important to keep in mind. Not all success criteria involve the same amount of effort and expertise and experience. So keep that in mind when you have a checklist in mind. keep in mind that some success criteria are going to take longer to work through than others. And this part is really going to help make this a lot more clear when you are looking at the web content accessibility guidelines and you are looking at 2.1 and 2.2, and you know that everyone references AA, but then you also see AAA and single A. That's what's going on here. When we're looking at compliance with the law, it's always going to come back to level AA conformance. And then what is required can vary. It's usually WCAG 2.1 that is considered either what is required for compliance or is a best practice. 2.0 is to the point where, yes, we still see this referenced in the law, but it was published so long ago and it's somewhat outdated when we're looking at modern technology. So we really don't want to strive for WCAG 2.0 level AA conformance, although it's definitely not a bad standard to reach for. You want to go beyond that, and 2.1 is going to help you with that. If you want to go to 2.2, you certainly can, but for compliance, I haven't seen that formally incorporated or adopted anywhere. But it's very possible in the future, but right now, just know that 2.1 AA is going to give you a fair amount of work, and for compliance, that is the most commonly referenced standard. And so scrolling on down this overview we have here, I have the backwards compatible, which I explained previously, and then understanding success criteria. And I also have a checklist of the success criteria. So this is just scrolling down this, you can just see there are different requirements. And I also say things to account for, because it is very likely that with your website, with your web app, etc., you very likely already meet several of these success criteria. And so then you just have to account for them and make sure that you do, in fact, meet the different success criteria. So as I stated, in WCAG 2.0, Conformance Level AA, there are 38 success criteria. With 2.1, we build on top of 2.0, and there are 50 success criteria, 12 of which are new. All right, so I'm going to scroll past 2.2 AA. We get into some more nuanced aspects of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And here I have a section on sufficient techniques and advisory techniques. Let's just touch on sufficient techniques really quickly. For sufficient techniques, these are listed out in the specific success criterion. If you look at the official success criterion page, and you will see sufficient techniques for conformance with that success criterion. So that's what's important to know, is that these are multi-layered. There are different considerations in play. Sometimes the criterion is very straightforward, and other times there are multiple considerations. And when it gets to sufficient techniques, there are more than one way to meet the success criterion. And then we have a section on principles. And so here we see perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So POUR is the acronym here. These are the principles that we can extract from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And as I mentioned earlier, we can apply these principles to non-web assets. So even though the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines don't apply perfectly to non-web assets like software and native mobile apps, we can still use the principles to make our non-web assets more accessible. And so here I have the levels of conformance. We've talked through this. Think of single A as foundational, think of double A as comprehensive, and then triple A as exemplary. And then continuing on, measuring conformance. When we measure conformance, conformance requires full conformance. You cannot be partially conformant with a criterion. You need to be fully conformant, or you're not fully conformant. Where partial conformance can come into play is when you have third-party integrations prevent conformance, and then we can have a conformance statement, which would be a statement of partial conformance, which speaks to the fact that we have made all of the content within our control accessible and conformant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for a given version and conformance level. However, there is third-party content outside of our control, which is non-conformant. So that's where we get into partial conformance, but it's really either you meet the criterion or you do not. And then here, another important section, And this is just to keep terminology straight. It's actually never WCAG compliance. And the reason why is because the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are voluntary technical standards. Now, they may be required under the law, but they are not the law themselves. So we always use the word conformance with WCAG. WCAG conformance. WCAG conformance. We are conforming to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We are complying with the law. So the law is where compliance comes into play. So ADA compliance, EAA compliance, Section 508 compliance, and then WCAG conformance. So keeping that terminology straight, usually everyone understands what everyone else is getting at, but it is helpful for technical alignment. All right. So when it comes to certification, so can you get certification? There is no official certification from the Worldwide Web Consortium, so the W3C. They do not issue out certification, but you can get a conformance statement issued by an accessibility provider. You can also get a provider certification from that provider that speaks to full conformance. That is the requirement for certification. Just know that anybody can technically issue certification, so the reputability of the provider matters greatly. All right, and then I've already talked about application to web and non-web assets. And then here we get into training. I also have training on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'm going to tab to the course now. This is not the end of the video. I'm going to go over a checklist in a moment, but here is the WCAG course. This is my course. I talk through every single success criterion in WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2 Conformance Level AA. So I've tabbed to the course page now, and I will include a link to this in the description. Now let's continue on. We're going to go to the WCAG checklist page on accessible.org. So what's really helpful for a lot of people when they just get started with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is to go straight to a checklist. Now, a checklist is going to give you the key takeaways from the success criteria, but it's not going to give you everything you need to know. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are in many ways multi-layered, as I was talking about earlier. So there are just different dynamics, maybe not so much dynamics, but there are just different layers to some of the or many of the requirements. So learning the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is not as simple as looking at a checklist, but a checklist is a very helpful reference, especially once you start to learn the full requirements. Then you can look back at the checklist as a reference sheet, and then you will have a better feel for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So on this page, and when we look at the WCAG table, as I was saying earlier, we can extract the quick takeaway for each of the success criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down the table now. And when we get to the bottom of the table, now we have my downloadable PDFs. So you can download the checklist, you can download the full guides, and this is all here. No subscription is required. You can just download these straight to your computer. And I recently updated the guides. If you'd like to download my legacy guides, I have these divided into WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 AA. And then there's a separate guide and checklist for 2.2. There's also another video where I quickly go through all of the success criteria in WCAG 2.1 AA. And so here we have this under the heading video checklist. So that video is also available, and I will include a link to it in the description. And then here we have another checklist where we are separating out all of the success criteria into different tables. So we have a table for 2.0 AA. That's where you'd start. Then you'd progress to 2.1. And then we have 2.2. And then we have a video preview of my WCAG course where I explain more about the course. And then here's some more background on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and the different disabilities that we are considering with these technical standards. And then we get into the principles. So we have the perceivable, operable, and robust, and what each mean. And then we get into more of an explanation on the versions and conformance levels. And so that's what I wanted to show you today. Now you'll have a much better understanding, a much better feel for what's going on with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And if you have any specific questions, like what is the difference between 2.1 and 2.2, and so many other questions. I've answered these all on accessible.org. So if you go to accessible.org and you enter in WCAG in the search, you can find all of the posts and pages that I have on the web content accessibility guidelines. And I've answered most of the questions that anyone has ever asked me or that you can think of. So if you need help, further help with the web content accessibility guidelines, I highly recommend visiting accessible.org. Again, those resources, the PDFs, they are free to download. There's no email subscription required. And then if you would like the full explanations where I break down each success criterion in my course, the WCAG course, you can sign up for that. And so I will include links to all of these resources in the description.